In the velvet blackness of a New Guinea ridgeline, where the air is so thick with moisture, it feels like breathing through a wet wool blanket. 19-year-old Private Arthur "Bluey" Thompson from the 216th Battalion isn't thinking about king and country or the glory of the British Empire. He is thinking about the leech currently burrowing into the soft flesh behind his left ear and the fact that his boots have not been dry since August, because this is the Kokoda track in late 1942, a place that military historians will later sanitize with maps and arrows, but which for the men on the ground is simply a vertical green hell designed by a vengeful god to break the human spirit long before the enemy ever fires a shot, and Arthur doesn't know it yet. But the Japanese Imperial Army, which has swept through Asia like a tidal wave of steel and discipline, is about to learn that the jungle has teeth, and those teeth are Australian. But tonight, there is only the waiting, the terrible silence that isn't really silence at all, but a cacophony of insects screaming in the dark, masking the sound of 2,000 enemy soldiers moving up the slope with the quiet efficiency of apex predators. And the tactical doctrine that is about to unfold over the next 96 days will not be found in any manual printed in London or Canberra. It is being written right here in blood and dysentery and madness, born of a desperation so profound it strips men of their humanity until only the animal remains. The year is 1942, and the world is burning, but nowhere does the fire burn quite as strangely as it does in the Owen Stanley Range, where the Japanese war machine, accustomed to swift victories on open roads and coastal plains, has just collided with a terrain that defies logic. A landscape of razor-backed ridges and valleys so deep the sun only touches the bottom for 2 hours a day, and defending this nightmare are men like Arthur Thompson, militia soldiers derisively called chocolate soldiers by their AIF counterparts because they're expected to melt in the heat of battle. But the chocolate isn't melting. It is hardening into something brittle and sharp and incredibly dangerous, because these men have nowhere left to run, with the Australian mainland sitting just across the Coral Sea like a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked, and the fear of invasion hanging over every decision like a guillotine blade. So the strategy shifts from conventional defense to something darker, something improvised, and terrifyingly intimate, a shift that begins not with a grand order from General MacArthur in his polished headquarters, but with a whisper passed down the line from Sergeant Jack "Dingo" Roberts, a 30-year-old sheep shearer from Western Australia, who understands that in this green cathedral sight is useless and sound is death. So you don't fight the enemy, you fight his mind, you become the jungle itself, and you make him afraid to close his eyes. To understand the insanity of what is about to happen, we must first strip away the newsreel footage of smiling troops and flag-waving, and look at the reality of the Japanese soldier facing them, specifically men like Corporal Kenji Ito of the South Seas Detachment, a veteran of the China campaigns who has marched hundreds of miles believing in the divine wind and the invincibility of the Emperor's army, but who is now sitting in a foxhole filled with black water, listening to the jungle breathe, and realizing that for the first time in this war, he is not the hunter but the prey, because the Australians have stopped fighting like Europeans and started fighting like ghosts, disappearing into the foliage only to reappear 3 feet away with a bayonet or a grenade or a sharpened shovel. And the psychological impact of this transformation is documented in a captured diary found months later in the mud of an overrun position. A diary that doesn't speak of tactical maneuvers, but of a green demon that strikes without sound and vanishes without trace, leaving only mutilated bodies and a fear so palpable it causes seasoned veterans to fire blindly into the trees until their ammunition is exhausted. The context is critical, because up until this moment, the Japanese tactic of infiltration and encirclement had been unstoppable. They would pin the enemy frontally, then move through the jungle flanks to cut off retreat, creating panic and surrender. But here on the Kokoda track, the Australians are doing something the manual says is impossible. They are staying put. They are letting themselves be encircled, and then they are fighting backwards, fighting sideways, fighting in every direction, simultaneously turning the encirclement into a chaotic melee where front lines dissolve, and every shadow holds a potential death. And this hedgehog defense, this refusal to panic when cut off, creates a grinding attrition that the Japanese supply lines stretched thin over razor peaks cannot sustain. Because while a Japanese soldier can march on a handful of rice, he cannot fight on empty magazines, and the Australians are making them pay for every single yard of mud with a currency the Imperial Army cannot afford to spend time. Let's zoom in on the microterrain of Isurava, where the sheer brutality of this new warfare is crystallizing into a specific incident that exemplifies the madness. Private Thompson is dug in near a small creek, his uniform rotting off his body, his skin covered in tropical ulcers that eat into the muscle tissue, and he is watching the trail below through the sights of a Bren gun, his finger hovering over the trigger guard, not touching it, just hovering, because discipline is the only thing keeping him sane. And he sees movement, not a soldier but a bush moving against the wind, a slight unnatural shivering of the leaves that shouldn't be there, and normally he would fire. But the new orders are strictly fire discipline. Wait until you can see the whites of their eyes, or rather the gold of their teeth. Wait until the scream is trapped in their throat, and then unleash hell. So he waits, and his heart hammers against his ribs like a trapped bird, and the bush moves closer and closer, until it is 10 yards away, and suddenly the camouflage drops, and 3 Japanese infantrymen charge with fixed bayonets, screaming, "Banzai!" a sound that usually freezes the blood, but Thompson doesn't freeze. He exhales a breath he didn't know he was holding, and squeezes the trigger. The Bren gun bucking against his shoulder, sending a burst of 303 rounds that tears through the lead attacker's chest, disintegrating the ribcage, and dropping him instantly into the mud, while the second man stumbles over the body, and the third keeps coming eyes wide with the fanaticism of the doomed. And Thompson shifts his aim slightly, the mechanical action smooth and practiced, and cuts him down mid-stride, the body falling forward with such momentum it slides almost into the foxhole. And then there is silence again, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of the Bren gun's barrel cooling, a metallic ticking that sounds like a clock counting down the seconds of their lives. But this is just one engagement in 1,000 simultaneous firefights happening along a track that is less a road and more a scar on the face of the earth. And the Australians are learning that to survive they must embrace the horror completely. They stop burying the dead because the ground is too hard or too wet or they are too exhausted, so the bodies simply become part of the terrain, bloated and decomposing in the tropical heat. The smell of death becoming as pervasive as the humidity, a sweet, sickly cloying scent that coats the back of the throat and never goes away. And in this environment the mind begins to crack. Men start talking to people who aren't there. They see faces in the bark of trees. They hear voices in the rain, and the line between sanity and madness blurs until it is indistinguishable. And it is here in this psychological twilight zone that the insane tactic takes root. A decision by mid-level officers like Lieutenant Harry Breaker Morant, no relation to the famous one. Just a coincidence of naming to use the dead as weapons, to prop up corpses in firing positions, to create the illusion of strength where there is none to booby-trap the bodies of their own fallen comrades, knowing the Japanese will scavenge them for supplies, a violation of every civilized norm of warfare. But civilization stopped at Port Moresby, and up here there is only survival. The Japanese response to this stiffening resistance is confusion followed by rage, because their intelligence reports told them the Australians were weak, that they would run at the first sign of aggression, but instead they are facing a stubborn, bloody-minded refusal to yield that borders on the suicidal, and the Japanese commanders, specifically Major General Hori, are forced to commit more and more resources to dislodge these pockets of resistance, resources they do not have, because the supply trains are breaking down under the strain of the terrain, and the constant harassment from the air, where Allied planes are strafing anything that moves on the track, turning the supply columns into trails of broken bodies and shattered equipment. We need to understand the logistics of this hell, to understand the desperation a Japanese soldier carries, 60 pounds of gear, plus his rifle and ammunition, and he is climbing gradients of 45 degrees in mud that is knee-deep, sucking at his boots with every step, and by the time he reaches the front line he is exhausted, starving and likely suffering from malaria or dysentery, and then he is ordered to charge a fortified machine gun nest manned by Australians who have had just enough bully beef and biscuits to keep pulling the trigger. And the result is a slaughter, a meat grinder that churns through human lives with terrifying efficiency, and yet they keep coming wave after human wave, driven by an ideology that views surrender as a fate worse than death. And the Australians watch this spectacle with a mixture of horror and grudging respect, realizing that they are fighting an enemy who does not fear death, but who is perhaps beginning to fear the jungle and the men who have become one with it. Back in the rear echelons, far away from the blood and the stench, the generals are looking at maps and moving pins and talking about strategic withdrawals and elastic defense, but for Arthur Thompson and his mates, there is nothing elastic about it. Every step back is a defeat. Every inch of ground yielded is a betrayal of the mates they left behind in shallow graves or no graves at all. And so a bitterness takes root, a deep, cynical anger directed not just at the enemy, but at the high command who sent them here ill-equipped and unprepared, wearing khaki uniforms that stand out against the green jungle, carrying weapons that jam in the mud, and eating rations that would be rejected by a starving dog. And this anger becomes fuel, a cold, hard resolve to survive just to spite the bastards on both sides. The diary of Sergeant Roberts provides a window into this hardening soul. He writes on September 14th, "We are not men anymore. We are just things that kill and sleep and kill again." I look at the new reinforcements coming up the track, fresh-faced boys from Sydney and Melbourne, and I feel pity because I know that in a week they will be like us, hollow-eyed and empty, or they will be dead, and I don't know which is better. A sentiment that captures the nihilism spreading through the ranks like a virus, a sense that the world outside the jungle has ceased to exist, and that this green tunnel is the only reality that matters. And then comes the rain. Not a gentle shower, but a deluge, a monolithic wall of water that falls for days on end, turning the track into a river of slime, washing away foxholes, flooding dugouts, and making weapons rust before your eyes. And the misery reaches a crescendo where men simply stop moving. They sit in the mud and let the rain wash over them, too tired to shiver, too broken to care. And it is in these moments of absolute abject misery that the Australian soldier discovers a dark humor, a coping mechanism that baffles the Japanese, who hear laughter coming from the enemy lines in the middle of a monsoon. Laughter that sounds maniacal and terrifying, because what kind of demon laughs in hell? The Japanese commander on the ridge opposite Thompson's position, Captain Yamada, hears this laughter and notes in his field report, "The enemy is insane. They laugh at the rain. They laugh at the mortars. They are possessed by spirits of the forest." And this perception of insanity becomes a weapon in itself, because a rational enemy can be predicted. A rational enemy will retreat when outflanked or surrender when outnumbered, but an insane enemy is unpredictable, dangerous, and terrifying. And so the legend of the White Devils begins to circulate among the Japanese troops, whispering around the campfires that the Australians eat the flesh of the dead, that they cannot be killed by normal bullets, that they are monsters in human skin. Myths born of fear and exhaustion, but myths that have a tangible impact on morale, causing hesitation, where there should be aggression, causing sentries to fire at shadows, causing a paralysis of initiative that is fatal in the jungle. Now let us look at the tactic referenced in the title, which is not a single maneuver but a doctrine of psychological disintegration. The Australians begin to conduct night raids, not to take ground, but to take sleep. They crawl into the Japanese perimeter, slit a throat and crawl out. Leaving the body to be found in the morning, they string empty tins with pebbles on the wire to create noise. They fire single shots at irregular intervals just to keep heads down. They scream insults in broken Japanese. They throw rocks to simulate grenades. They wage a war on the nervous system of the enemy, denying them the one thing they need more than food or water, which is rest. And after 3 days of no sleep, the hallucinations start. The paranoia sets in, and the Japanese unit cohesion begins to fray at the edges. Officers start arguing with NCOs, men start seeing enemies in their own ranks, and the fighting efficiency drops by 50% simply because the brain cannot process the trauma anymore. One specific raid led by a corporal named WWII, unrelated to Arthur Thompson, becomes legendary. In the battalion he takes 3 men, covers them in mud and charcoal until they are invisible, and they crawl for 4 hours, covering maybe 200 yards, moving only when the wind blows or the thunder rolls, and they penetrate the Japanese perimeter, finding a mortar pit where the crew is sleeping exhausted, and instead of killing them immediately, they rearrange the mortar rounds, stealing the firing pins and leaving a note written in English that simply says bang, before slipping away into the darkness. And when the Japanese wake up and try to fire the mortar and find it useless, the psychological blow is devastating, because it proves that the enemy was there right beside them while they slept, and could have killed them all, but chose to mock them instead. And this feeling of vulnerability is more damaging than any casualty count, because it destroys the myth of their own superiority. Meanwhile, the physical toll on the Australians is mounting. Private Thompson has lost 20 pounds. His ribs are showing through his skin. His eyes are sunken into black pits, and he is suffering from dysentery so bad he has cut the seat out of his trousers because there is no point in pulling them down anymore. And he is not alone. The entire battalion is wasting away, consumed by the jungle and the war. And yet they hold. They hold because there is nowhere else to go, and because they have developed a fierce tribal loyalty to the man on their left and the man on their right, a bond that is stronger than patriotism or discipline, a bond forged in the shared suffering of the track. The medical situation is catastrophic. The wounded have to be carried back down the track by the fuzzy-wuzzy angels, the native Papuan bearers who perform miracles of endurance carrying stretchers over terrain that a goat would struggle with. But even with their help, the journey is an agony of jolts and slips, and many men die on the way, their wounds turning gangrenous in the heat. The smell of rotting flesh trailing the columns of walking, wounded like a grim perfume, and the doctors at the aid. Stations are performing amputations with hacksaws, and no anesthetic except a shot of morphine if they are lucky, or a stick to bite on if they are not, and the screams echo through the valleys, adding to the soundscape of horror. It is important to pause and visualize the weaponry involved here, specifically the Owen gun, a submachine gun designed by an Australian teenager in his garage, which the army initially rejected because it looked like a piece of plumbing, which it essentially was, but which turns out to be the perfect weapon for this war because, unlike the Thompson or the Sten, the Owen gun does not jam. It can be dipped in mud, filled with sand, submerged in water, and it will still fire. And for men like Arthur Thompson, this reliability is the difference between life and death, and the distinctive thud-thud-thud of the Owen gun becomes the sound of Australian resistance, a sound the Japanese learn to hate because it signifies an ambush, a raid, a sudden violent death from close quarters. On September 20th, the Japanese launch a massive coordinate assault on the Australian positions at WWII Ridge, throwing everything they have left into a desperate bid to break the line and reach Port Moresby, and the fighting descends into a primal brawl, hand-to-hand combat, with knives and bayonets and entrenching tools, men grappling in the mud, drowning each other in puddles, gouging eyes, tearing at throats, a chaotic swirling melee where command and control is impossible, and it comes down to individual survival instincts. And here the Australian insanity pays off, because they fight with a reckless abandon that shocks the Japanese, repeatedly counterattacking when they should be retreating, throwing themselves onto grenades to save their mates refusing to stay down, when hit acting with a ferocity that matches the Japanese Bushido code and in some cases exceeds it. During this battle, Private Thompson finds himself cut off from his platoon surrounded by enemy soldiers, his ammunition gone, and he grabs a machete dropped by a dead Papuan bearer and backs up against a tree waiting for the end, and 3 Japanese soldiers approach cautious, now wary of the cornered animal. And Thompson screams a primal wordless sound of rage and defiance and charges them not away from them but directly at them, swinging the machete with the strength of a madman, and the sheer, unexpected violence of the act catches them off guard. He strikes the first man in the neck, the blade biting deep, and the man goes down gurgling blood, and the other 2 hesitate just for a second, but that second is enough for Thompson to dodge a bayonet thrust and strike again, hacking at arms and faces, a whirlwind of steel and fury, until reinforcements from B Company arrive, drawn by the noise, and drive the Japanese back, leaving Thompson standing over the bodies, chest heaving, covered in blood. Not. His own eyes wild and unseeing, and his sergeant has to physically slap him to snap him out of the berserker state. This incident is not isolated. It is symptomatic of what the war has done to these men, stripped away the layers of civilization, until the killer underneath is revealed. And while the folks back home in Australia are knitting socks and buying war bonds, they have no conception of what their boys have become. They think of them as heroes, but Thompson doesn't feel like a hero. He feels like a butcher. He feels dirty inside and out, and he knows that if he ever gets home, he will never be able to explain. He will never be able to tell his mother what it feels like to hack a man to death in a muddy hole in the ground. So he will bury it deep down in the silence where the nightmares live. The Japanese offensive eventually stalls, not because of a single decisive battle, but because they have simply run out of steam, run out of food, run out of men. The green hell has consumed them. Their supply lines are non-existent. Their soldiers are starving skeletons who can barely lift their rifles. And the Australian hedgehog tactics, the constant harrying, the refusal to break, has bled them white and slowly. Imperceptibly, the tide begins to turn. The hunters become the hunted. The momentum shifts. And the Australians, sensing the weakness, begin to push back, not with a grand offensive, but with a steady, relentless pressure, pushing the Japanese back up the track, back towards the sea, back into the graves they dug for themselves. But the cost is staggering. The 216th Battalion, which marched into the mountains with over 600 men, is now down to less than 200 effective soldiers. The rest are dead wounded or sick with malaria, and those who remain are ghosts, walking shadows of men with 1,000-yard stares and trembling hands. But they are ghosts with guns, and they are not done yet. The order comes down from headquarters to advance, to retake Kokoda, to drive the enemy into the sea, and Arthur Thompson cleans his. Bren Gunn checks his magazines, tightens his bootlaces, and stands up, ready to walk back into the fire, ready to endure another day of hell. Because that is what he does. That is what they all do. They endure, they survive, and they kill, because the alternative is unimaginable. As they advance, they find the evidence of the Japanese collapsed bodies, left unburied equipment, abandoned letters and diaries scattered in the mud, providing a glimpse into the minds of the men they have been fighting, capturing the despair and the longing for home. Corporal Ito's diary is found by an intelligence officer, and translated it reads, October 4th. No rice left. We are eating roots and lizards. The men are dying of sickness every day. The enemy is relentless. They are demons. They give us no rest. I dream of cherry blossoms and my mother's face. But when I wake up, there is only the jungle and the rain and the Australians. I do not think I will see Japan again. A poignant reminder that the enemy is human too, suffering just as they are. But this humanity does not stop the killing. It just adds a layer of tragedy to the slaughter, a realization that this is a war between victims driven by forces beyond their control into a collision of unparalleled violence. The camera of history pulls back, now revealing the vast expanse of the jungle, the canopy stretching for miles in every direction, a sea of green hiding the carnage beneath, and we understand that this is not just a battle for territory. This is a battle for the soul of a nation, for the survival of a way of life fought by men who have been fundamentally changed by the experience. Men who have looked into the abyss and found the abyss, looking back with a grin. The captured orders mentioned in the title are finally discovered in a command post near Templeton's Crossing, a bundle of documents wrapped in oilskin that lay out the Japanese perspective on the campaign, and the revelation is shocking. The orders detail a plan to isolate and starve the Australian forces, to use psychological warfare to break their will. But the marginalia, the handwritten notes by the Japanese commanders, tell a different story, notes that speak of unexpected resistance, of enemy, tactics defying standard doctrine, of fear among the troops regarding the Australian night attacks, confirming that the insane tactics were working, that the psychological disintegration was mutual, that the Japanese fear of the jungle was being amplified by the Australian mastery of it. This revelation doesn't change the outcome of the battles already fought, but it validates the suffering. It proves that the madness had a method, that the sacrifice was not in vain. And as the intelligence officer reads these documents under the light of a flickering lantern, he feels a cold chill, not from the damp air, but from the realization of how close they came to defeat, how thin the line was between holding and breaking, and how much they owe to the chocolate soldiers who turned out to be made of steel. The first part of this saga ends not with a parade or a medal ceremony, but with Arthur Thompson sitting on a log in the pouring rain, eating a tin of cold bully beef, staring at his shaking hands, trying to wash the blood from under his fingernails. But it won't come out. It's stained deep into the skin, just as the war is stained deep into his soul. And as he looks up into the canopy, he sees a break in the clouds, a single shaft of sunlight piercing the gloom, illuminating a patch of green ferns. And for a second, just a second, he remembers what beauty looks like before the clouds close in again, and the darkness returns, bringing with it the night and the enemy and the endless waiting for the next shot, the next scream, the next death, in a war that feels like it will never end. The narrative arc of these 96 days is a descent into the primitive, a stripping away of the veneer of civilization to reveal the raw, animalistic struggle for survival. And in this crucible, the Australian soldier forged a legend, not of dashing heroics, but of stubborn endurance, of mateship, and of a terrifying competence in the art of killing, a legend that would haunt the Japanese survivors for the rest of their lives and shape the national identity of Australia for generations to come. But for now there is no legend. There is only the mud and the blood and the rain and the sound of breathing in the dark, waiting for the morning that might never come. The advance back up the Kokoda track is not a triumphant march. It is a slow and agonizing crawl through a graveyard of their own, making a journey backwards in time over the same ground where they had bled and retreated only weeks before. And for Private Arthur Thompson, every step is a ghost story, every fallen tree a monument to a dead mate, every muddy creek a reminder of a desperate firefight. Now the roles are reversed. They are the hunters, and the Japanese are the quarry. But the jungle does not care about sides. It is an impartial torturer, and the rain still falls, the leeches still bite, the dysentery still flows, and the victory they are chasing feels less like liberation and more like a deeper circle of hell, because now the Australians are not just fighting for survival. They are fighting with the cold, methodical purpose of exterminators, and this new role sits heavy on their souls, a poison that seeps into the cracks of their already fractured minds. Sergeant Jack "Dingo" Roberts watches his men and sees the change. They move with a new kind of silence, a predator's economy of motion. Their eyes are no longer wide with fear, but narrowed with a grim focus. They have learned the jungle's grammar, its syntax of sound and shadow, and they are using it to dismantle the enemy piece by bloody piece. But in his diary, Roberts writes, "We are winning, but we are losing ourselves. We came here to fight monsters, but you can't live in the sewer without becoming a rat." And this sentiment hangs in the air thicker than the swarms of mosquitoes. The price of this victory is a piece of their humanity, a piece they know they will never get back. The Japanese retreat is not an orderly withdrawal. It is a death march, a disintegration of an army. They are leaving behind a trail of abandoned equipment and bodies, some dead from starvation, others from suicide, a pistol shot to the head, or a grenade held against the stomach. And the Australians move through this landscape of despair with a mixture of revulsion and a dark satisfaction, a feeling they are ashamed to admit. Even to themselves, they find Japanese soldiers who have simply sat down by the side of the track and died of exhaustion, their rifles still clutched in their skeletal hands, waiting for an enemy that has already passed them by. And the sheer scale of the suffering is biblical, a testament to the brutal arithmetic of a war of attrition. But there is no pity here. There is only the grim task of cleaning up the mess, of pushing forward to the next objective, because pity is a luxury they cannot afford. Now they reach Eora Creek, a place the veterans will simply call the butcher's shop, a deep ravine with a fast-flowing river at the bottom, where the retreating Japanese have decided to make a stand. They have dug into the opposite slope, in a labyrinth of interlocking machine gun nests and rifle pits, creating a kill zone of terrifying efficiency, and the Australian High Command orders a frontal assault, a decision that seems suicidal to the men on the ground, but orders are orders. And so the 216th and the 214th Battalions prepare to cross the creek into a meat grinder. The attack begins with an artillery barrage that does little more than chew up the jungle canopy. The Japanese positions are dug too deep, and as the first wave of Australians scrambles down the slick, muddy bank and into the chest-deep water, the machine guns open up a rhythmic hammering sound that scythes through the ranks, turning the creek red in seconds, and Private Thompson is in the second wave, watching the men in front of him disappear beneath the churning water, their bodies tossed about like driftwood, and a cold dread grips him. a feeling that this is it, this is where they all die. But then he hears Sergeant Roberts screaming, "Move, you bastards, move, or you'll die right here," and something inside him breaks. He lets out a raw, guttural roar and plunges into the water, the cold shock of it momentarily clearing his head, and he swims and crawls and pushes his way across under a canopy of lead, shielded only by the bodies of his own comrades. He makes it to the other side, his lungs burning, his uniform snagged on a submerged branch, and he scrambles up the bank, with a handful of other survivors, finding cover behind a large moss-covered boulder. And for a moment he just lies there in the mud, gasping for air, listening to the symphony of death around him. The chatter of the Owen guns, the crack of the Arisaka rifles, the wet thud of bullets hitting flesh, and the screams, the endless screams of the wounded and the dying. And he looks at the man. Next to him, a new recruit named Leslie Davies, who can't be more than 18, and the boy is just staring at the creek, his face a mask of disbelief as if he cannot process the slaughter he has just witnessed, and Thompson grabs him by the shirt and shakes him hard. "Stay with me, Les, stay with me," he yells, but the boy's eyes are vacant. The 1,000-yard stare has claimed another soul. The battle for Yora Creek rages for a week, a brutal slugging match with no quarter asked, and none given. The Australians inch their way up the slope, one bunker at a time, using grenades and bayonets and sheer bloody-mindedness. They learn to coordinate their attacks, a small team, providing covering fire, while another crawls forward through the undergrowth to toss a grenade into the firing slit of a bunker, and then they rush the position before the dust settles, finishing off the survivors with the bayonet or a burst from an Owen gun. And it is intimate, dirty work, killing at arm's length, feeling the shudder of a man's body as the life leaves him, seeing the shock and hatred in his eyes. And Arthur Thompson becomes brutally efficient at it. He moves like a wraith through the jungle, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He can smell the faint scent of Japanese cooking oil on the wind. He can see the glint of a helmet from 50 yards away. He can hear the subtle click of a rifle bolt being drawn back. And he kills without hesitation, without remorse, because emotion is a liability and survival is all that matters. They discover the horror of the Japanese field hospital, a collection of thatched huts hidden in a small gully where hundreds of wounded Japanese soldiers had been left to die. They find men with horrific wounds rotting alive, covered in flies, their pleas for water ignored by their own retreating army. And in a final act of barbarism, the Japanese medical officers had systematically executed their patients before pulling back, killing them with morphine overdoses or a bullet to the head to prevent them from falling into Australian hands. And the sight of this clinical cruelty shocks even the hardened diggers. It is a violation of the warrior's code, a betrayal of their own men that speaks to a level of desperation that is almost incomprehensible. And for a moment the Australians and the dead Japanese are united in a shared humanity, victims of a war that has consumed all decency. But the battle grinds on, and the cost is horrific. Sergeant Roberts is hit by a sniper's bullet. The round passes clean through his shoulder, and he is carried back down the track, his face pale with pain, but his eyes are still clear, and as he passes Thompson, he grabs his arm and says, "Keep them moving, Bluey, keep them pushing." A transfer of responsibility, a passing of the torch, and suddenly Thompson feels the weight of command on his young shoulders. He is no longer just a private, he is a leader, a veteran responsible for the lives of the men around him, and the thought terrifies him more than any Japanese machine gun. The breakthrough at Yora Creek finally comes not from the frontal assault, but from a flanking maneuver by the 201st Battalion, who spend 3 days cutting a new path through the supposedly impenetrable jungle to get behind the Japanese positions. And when they attack from the rear, the Japanese line collapses. The defenders caught between two fires are annihilated, and the few who escape flee into the jungle, where most will starve to death, and the Australians take the ridge. But the victory is hollow. They have lost over 500 men killed or wounded to take a position that the Japanese were about to abandon anyway. And as Thompson stands on the summit looking back at the valley of death, he feels nothing, no pride, no relief, just a vast soul-crushing emptiness. The advance continues to Oivi and Garari, the last major Japanese defensive line before the coastal plains, and here the nature of the fighting changes again. They are out of the mountains now, and into the kunai grass and the swampy lowlands. But the enemy is still waiting, dug in and determined to fight to the last man. The Japanese have been reinforced by fresh troops who have not yet been broken by the jungle, and they fight with the fanaticism of the unconquered, and the Australians themselves are reinforced by fresh American troops of the 32nd Infantry Division. But the alliance is uneasy. The Americans are green, ill-equipped for jungle warfare, and they suffer appalling casualties, their commanders making the same mistakes the Australians made months earlier, sending them in frontal assaults against fortified positions. And a friction develops between the Allies, the Australians resentful of the Americans' naivety, and the Americans suspicious of the Australians' grim, uncommunicative nature. Arthur Thompson finds himself fighting alongside a platoon of Americans during the assault on Gorari, and he is appalled by their lack of jungle craft. They bunch up on the trail. They talk loudly. They smoke cigarettes at night, making them perfect targets for ambush, and Thompson tries to warn their young lieutenant, a fresh-faced boy from Ohio named Miller, but the officer is dismissive. "We have our own doctrine, Corporal," he says condescendingly, and a few hours later the platoon walks into a perfectly laid Japanese ambush and is cut to pieces. Lieutenant Miller is among the first to die, shot through the chest before he can even draw his pistol, and Thompson and his section are forced to fight their way out, leaving the American dead and wounded behind. And the incident hardens Thompson's heart even further, cementing his belief that the only people he can rely on are his own mates, the men who have walked the same path of fire. The capture of the Japanese orders becomes a critical tool in this stage of the campaign. The intelligence gleaned from Corporal Ito's diary and the command documents from Templeton's Crossing allows the Australians to predict the enemy's movements, to understand their state of mind, to exploit their weaknesses. They learn that the Japanese are terrified of being cut off, that their command structure is rigid and slow to adapt, and that their greatest fear is not death, but dishonor. And the Australian commanders use this knowledge to lay sophisticated traps. They feign retreats to lure the Japanese into kill zones. They use psychological operations, broadcasting messages in Japanese, telling them they are abandoned and that their cause is lost. They target officers knowing that the loss of a commander will often cause a unit to collapse, and slowly but surely they are dismantling the Japanese war machine from the inside out, using its own rigidity against it. But this intellectual warfare does not diminish the visceral reality on the ground. During the final push on Gorari, Thompson's section is pinned down by a woodpecker, a light machine gun hidden in a treetop bunker that has a perfect field of fire, and men are dying around him. And he knows they have to take it out or they will all be wiped out. So he makes a decision, a cold, calculated choice born of rage and desperation. He hands his Owen gun to Leslie Davies, who is now a hardened veteran himself. Anne says, "Cover me," and then he starts crawling towards the tree with 2 grenades in his hands. The world narrows to the 20 yards of open ground between him and the bunker. He can hear the bullets snapping past his head. He can feel the ground shudder from the mortar impacts, but he doesn't stop. He keeps crawling inch by inch, fueled by a white-hot fury, a desire to silence the gun that is killing his friends. And he gets to the base of the tree, pulls the pin on the first grenade, and throws it up into the bunker, but he misjudges the angle, and it bounces off a branch and falls back down, exploding harmlessly a few feet away, and the gunner in the bunker sees him and swings the weapon down, and Thompson looks up and sees the muzzle flash, and he knows he is dead. He closes his eyes waiting for the impact, but it never comes. He opens them and sees Leslie Davies standing up in the open, firing his Owen gun from the hip, a full magazine into the bunker, drawing all the fire onto himself, and the Japanese gunner swivels and stitches a line of bullets across Davies' chest, and the boy falls, without a sound, a look of surprise on his face. The sacrifice gives Thompson the second he needs. He pulls the pin on the final grenade, stands up, and throws it with all his might. And this time, it lands true, a perfect arc into the center of the bunker, and there is a muffled explosion, followed by a scream that is cut short and then silence, and the gun is silent. And Thompson stumbles back to his line, his ears ringing, his mind numb, and he falls to his knees beside Les Davies' body and looks at the boy's face, peaceful now in death. And for the first time since the campaign began, Arthur Thompson weeps. He weeps for the boy, for his sergeant, for all the dead, and for the man he has become a killer who sends boys to their death to save his own skin. The fall of WWII marks the end of the Kokoda track campaign. The path to the coast is open, and the remaining Japanese are in full retreat towards their last-ditch defenses at Buna and Gona. But for the men of the 216th, there is no celebration. They are withdrawn from the line shattered and depleted, a ghost of a battalion to be replaced by fresh American and Australian troops for the final coastal battles, and as they march back down the track, past the graves of their friends and their enemies, they are silent skeletons in ragged uniforms, their eyes holding the terrible knowledge of what it takes to win a war in hell. Arthur Thompson is given a medal for his bravery at Eora Creek and Gorari, a small piece of bronze on a colored ribbon. But he keeps it in his pocket. He never wears it because he feels like a fraud. The medal belongs to Les Davies, to Sergeant Roberts, to all the men who didn't make it back. And as he sits on the transport ship heading back to Australia, he looks out at the jungle receding in the distance, a monstrous green wall that has consumed his youth and his innocence. And he knows that a part of him will never leave that place. A part of him will forever be crawling in the mud of Eora Creek, listening to the screams and the rain and the silence that follows. The 96 days of hell on the Kokoda track are over, but the war in the minds of the survivors has just begun. They have seen the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human sacrifice. They have learned that courage and madness are two sides of the same coin, and they carry this knowledge like a physical wound, a scar that will never fully heal, and the captured orders that revealed the enemy's fear were a small, cold comfort, a confirmation that their insane tactics had worked. But they also served as a mirror reflecting their own descent into a darkness from which some would never return. This part of the story concludes as the survivors are pulled from the furnace, leaving the final act of destruction on the coast to fresh hands. But the jungle holds its secrets, and the ghosts of Kokoda will walk with these men forever, whispering in their dreams, reminding them of the price of victory, a price paid in blood and sanity, on a muddy track in a forgotten corner of the world.